Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Today I want to talk about First Enoch and the identity of the Messiah. We see the book of Jude in the New Testament referencing, or rather quoting from the book of First Enoch, which is obviously not in the Bible. But again, this quote from First Enoch does make its way into the book of Jude towards the end of the New Testament in the Bible. And it's interesting because it quotes a prophecy from First Enoch, and it speaks of that prophecy as true. Now, because of this, some people have used First Enoch as a way to interpret some things that we find in the New Testament and Old Testament, specifically the question of the Nephilim and the theory of who the sons of God are in the book of Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God who go into the daughters of men and produce giants on the earth. First Enoch is all about that issue. And so some people have looked to First Enoch as a way to interpret some of those passages in the New Testament and Old Testament on the question of the Nephilim. But it's important to be aware of some other things that you might not be aware that are in First Enoch, specifically on the identity of the Messiah. Of course, the Messiah refers to the anointed one. It's something we find in the Old Testament that applies often to kings. They were anointed for their position as a king. So the Messiah is this figure in the Old Testament who will be this great king, a son of David, who is going to rule over the nations and free the people of Israel from bondage and servitude to other nations. And there's another number of passages that you could look to that would allude to this messianic figure. Now, of course, in the New Covenant with Christianity, those passages that you find in the Old Testament are applied to Jesus as the Messiah. But be aware that though Jude is quoting from First Enoch identifies the Messiah, but it doesn't identify Jesus as the Messiah. Which, of course, it couldn't do anyway directly or explicitly, because First Enoch was written prior to the New Testament and prior to Jesus. So Enoch actually identifies, believe it or not, Enoch as the Messiah. Kind of a weird concept, because it does speak of this messianic figure as being worshipped on earth. And Enoch is hearing in his, in this book, it describes Enoch hearing all sorts of passages from an angel about the Messiah, descriptions about this messianic figure. And Enoch has no idea who it is. And he finally asks who it is. And the angel tells him, it's you. You're the Messiah. It's kind of a weird concept, especially if you consider the fact that, again, Enoch identifies the Messiah as someone who is worshipped on earth, and very clearly Enoch, according to the book, is not a divine being, but rather purely human. So do be aware of this. Now, some people will say, we'll show the evidence for this. Or some people will just be in complete denial and just say, oh, Michael, you're lying. You're making this up. No, I wish I were, but I'm certainly not. It is an odd thing that the New Testament quotes from this book that identifies Enoch as the Messiah, not Jesus. But of course, it doesn't quote from that approvingly or anything. It quotes from something else in Enoch approvingly. Let's take a look at what Jude says first before we take a look at Enoch. So Jude, there's only one chapter, beginning verse 14. It was also about these that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, see, the Lord is coming, with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. This is a direct quote from First Enoch. And again, it's quoting it approvingly, and even saying that this charism of prophecy here was with the writer of Enoch whenever he spoke of this prophecy. Okay, but just because it quotes of this approvingly doesn't mean that it's quoting everything or approving of everything in the book. And that's kind of what we need to keep in mind here, because there is a big plot twist with First Enoch. So let's take a look at a good article that I saw by David Wilbur called "Who is the Son of Man" of First Enoch 71:14, that talks about this question of who is the Messiah in the book of Enoch. So he says some confusion surrounds the Son of Man in First Enoch, particularly in First Enoch 71:14, when this figure's identity is revealed. This article will argue in favor of the plain reading of First Enoch 71:14 that identifies the patriarch Enoch as this figure, as the Messiah. According to the parables of Enoch, First Enoch 37-71, Enoch is taken into heaven and shown prophetic visions concerning an eschatological hero known as the Son of Man. And that should automatically ring a bell, because if you've read the New Testament, Jesus often refers to himself as the Son of Man, and it's a messianic title, especially in light of Daniel chapter 7, where not only is it a messianic title, but it is a divine title, because the Son of Man figure rides on the clouds of heaven, something that only a divine being would do in the ancient Near Eastern culture. So clearly a reference to divinity. And that's how the people understood Jesus whenever he spoke of himself as the Son of Man. They understood it to be a reference to divinity. This figure is also called the Chosen One, Anointed, Righteous One, which are all titles referring to the same messianic figure in the narrative. The author of this section of First Enoch clearly draws upon messianic prophecies from Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel to develop this figure. According to the narrative, this messianic figure will sit on a throne of glory and judge the deeds of the wicked people who have rejected God. What does that sound like? Again, that sounds like the messianic figure, the Son of Man, in Daniel chapter 7. Afterward, he will come to earth to dwell with the righteous. The narrative goes on to describe how he will destroy sinners and strike down kings and rulers who are against God. Think of Psalm 2. Think of the book of Revelation, chapter 18. Right? Clearly, the New Testament is applying those concepts to Jesus. Okay, but let's see how Enoch understands these. It says he'll be a light to the nations. Now, who's the light to the nations? Well, you find that figure in Isaiah. In the New Covenant, that's applied to Jesus. Jesus is a light to the nations, to the Gentiles. He'll be worshipped by all who dwell on earth. That's 1 Enoch 48:5. Again, an interesting concept in light of what we're about to see on the identity of the Messiah. But he's clearly a figure who is worshipped on earth in 1 Enoch 48:5. In his name, the righteous will have salvation. Think of some passages here in Jeremiah, for instance. Finally, this messianic figure will usher in an era of peace. You find this concept associated with the Messiah both in the Old Testament and also with Jesus in the New Testament. So Enoch is taking all sorts of passages from the Old Testament that apply to Jesus in the New Covenant, but he's going to identify it as actually someone else. At the end of the parables of Enoch, Enoch is taken to the heaven of heavens, where he sees a fiery heavenly palace. There Enoch is greeted by God, the 4 archangels, and innumerable other angels. Surprisingly, Enoch is greeted as this Son of Man figure who he had seen in his vision. So he's seeing himself, but not even knowing it's himself. And so there's a huge plot twist here, where he is now identified as the Messiah, the Son of Man figure. And the head of days came from Michael and Raphael, Gabriel and Phanuel, and thousands and 10,000s of angels without number. And he came to me and greeted me with his voice and said to me, "You are the Son of Man, who was born for righteousness, and righteousness dwells on you, and the righteousness of the head of days will not forsake you." That's 1 Enoch 71:13-14. So Enoch, in this big plot twist, finds out he is this divine figure. He is the Son of Man who will be worshipped on earth, who will rule the nations. He is the anointed one, the Messiah. This quote comes from the Hermenia translation. This is important because there is going to be a translation issue here that you need to be aware of. And this is likely one of the reasons why you haven't heard of this before. If this translation of 1 Enoch 71:14 is correct, when it identifies Enoch as the messianic figure, then this should impact how much significance we place on these writings. And I concur with that. I mean, if Enoch is identifying Enoch as the Messiah, then, you got to take it with a grain of salt if you're going to use that as a Christian, right? Even though, again, Jude is quoting from it approvingly, it doesn't mean it's approving everything in there. I mean, Paul quotes from pagans. That doesn't mean he agrees with everything that the pagans say. So you might not want to overuse 1 Enoch in light of this. If the author of the parables of Enoch intended to identify Enoch as this figure who fulfills these messianic prophecies, then he puts the parables of Enoch, that is, 1 Enoch 37 through 71, in direct conflict with the teachings of the New Testament concerning the identity of the Messianic Son of Man, which I agree. I mean, obviously, it's one or the other. Either Enoch is the Messiah or Jesus is the Messiah. You can't have both. Either Enoch is this one who is going to rule the nations as a divine figure, or it's Jesus. Clearly, the New Testament identifies Jesus as it. So as a Christian, you cannot say Enoch is right about this point. Now, do we have good reasons to accept this translation as correct? Here's the issue with the translation. Many who have read 1 Enoch might point out that some older translations render the text differently. For instance, the popular, this is the one that's commonly used, the 1912 translation from R.H. Charles, has the verse in the third person rather than the second person. Thus, Charles' translation reads, "This is the Son of Man," instead of saying, "You, Enoch, are the Son of Man." This difference in translation has some big implications in regard to the revelation of the Son of Man's identity. Yeah, a world of difference. Is Enoch being identified as the Messiah? Or is Enoch seeing a different figure who is not Enoch, and he's seeing the Messiah, potentially Jesus, right? If Charles's translation is correct, then Enoch is not being revealed as this figure, but is being directed to a separate figure. So which one is it, right? Which translation? So then, which translation is correct? Should the verse read, "You are the Son of Man," or "This is the Son of Man"? First, we might ask why there is a difference in translation. Enochic scholars have long been puzzled by Enoch's identification of the Son of Man in Enoch 71:14, because it means that in his visions, Enoch didn't recognize himself as this figure until his identity is revealed to him at the end of the story. As scholar Leslie W. Walk writes, if this reading is authentic, then it is the only instance of apocalyptic autovision that survives in which the seer does not recognize himself. Charles was skeptical about Enoch not realizing that he was seeing himself in his visions. Thus, he changed the text of 1 Enoch 71:14 in light of the skepticism. He says, or Walk says, Charles's solution was to change the text of 1 Enoch 71:14 to the third person instead of the second person. Thus, Charles reads, "This is the Son of Man," rather than "You are the Son of Man." Then he made the necessary changes in the rest of the text to bring it into harmony with the third person rendering. So every other instance where it was clear it was actually in the second person, he changes all that to the third person as well. He also suggested that a paragraph which revealed the identity of the Son of Man has been lost. So he says, all right, I'm going to change it from the second person to the third person. And I'm going to change it all throughout the text. And I'm going to assume that there had to be some kind of explanation here in the text that's just been lost. But this extensive emendation has no surviving textual basis in any of the manuscripts, and for this reason is to be rejected. In other words, he's thinking, well, there has to be something lost here in the text. So we're missing something in the text, but there's no manuscript witness saying that there's another part that belonged to the text that's now somehow corrupted. It's a complete guess on his part. So he's literally changing the translation, changing the text, and he's doing so on the basis that there must be some kind of manuscript witness to this. We just don't have it. Renowned scholar John J. Collins likewise has criticized Charles' approach. The solution of Charles was to amend 71:14 to read, "This is the Son of Man," and change "you" to "him" in the following verses. This procedure has no basis in the text and is clearly unacceptable. Now, you could see why Charles would do that, right? You could see why he would have some theological motivation to change the text and identify the Son of Man here in the third person rather than second person. You can clearly see the motivation for that. As Walk points out, Charles theorized that a lost passage revealed the Son of Man figure as someone other than Enoch. Then, based on this theory, he deliberately mistranslated the Ethiopic text to reflect a third person rendering rather than what the text actually says, which is highly immoral, highly dishonest. In Charles's translation between verses 13 and 14, he then says this: "Lost passage wherein the Son of Man was described as accompanying the head of days, and Enoch asked one of the angels concerning the Son of Man as to who he was." And so he just interjects here, there must be some kind of lost passage explaining the context. The problem is that no evidence has ever surfaced to substantiate Charles's theory on which his translation of this passage is based. In other words, Charles's translation of the passage is driven by a baseless theory. In fact, in footnotes of his translation, Charles admits to amending the text and provides the correct translation, acknowledging that his rendering doesn't reflect what the text says. For this reason, modern Enochic scholarship unanimously rejects Charles's translation in favor of a literal rendering of what the verse actually says. But in all likelihood, if you've read through First Enoch, you've probably read Charles's translation where he deliberately mistranslates it. So I actually mentioned on the show this issue the other day, Enoch as the Messiah, according to Enoch. Not according to me, not according to the New Testament, just according to Enoch. And some people were like, Michael, you're just a liar. You're just making this up. That's not what the text says. You got to dig deeper. You got to dig deeper. Don't just assume people are lying. Don't just outright dismiss people. You got to dig deeper than that. You can't be this theologically lazy to accuse people of lying. Wasn't lying. What it is I'm aware of things that these accusers are not aware of. That's what's going on here. I'm aware that there was a change in the text by Charles that is not attested to in any other manuscript witness. And thus he changed everything in the second person to the third person and speculates that there had to be something that backs this up, and that most people are used to his translation and aren't familiar with what the actual Ethiopic, in fact, says. So I might suggest that, in the future, before just dismissing people outright or accusing them of lying, dig a little deeper, make sure that you know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you might be guilty of lying or bearing false witness. Now, I hope this was helpful because, again, it kind of puts into perspective how much can we actually use Enoch for in, an understanding of the New Testament or even the Old Testament. Well, if it's identifying Enoch as the Messiah, I don't know how much you could really use the text beyond what Jude uses it for. Because clearly you can't use it when it comes to the messianic identity, the identity of who the Messiah is, that clearly is in conflict with the New Testament. It also shows a curious concept because clearly at the time of Enoch, first Enoch, evidently a human figure could be worshipped as a divine being, as this one who is made divine, not divine by nature, but made divine, and thus worshipped on earth. Sort of an odd thing, I think, for most people who think about this, because you would just think, how in the world can someone merely human be worshipped? Doesn't seem right. It seems like idolatry. But that certainly impacts discussions on the question of worship of Jesus in the New Testament. Now, I do think that the New Testament identifies Jesus clearly as divine. And I think that there are some really interesting passages that speak about worship of Jesus. But don't think that immediately this is a knockdown, slam dunk argument for the divinity of Jesus, because if some Jews saw human figures as being able to be worshipped, specifically the Son of Man figure, then you have to do a little bit more to prove that the apostles and others who worship Jesus in the Gospels are worshiping him as a divine being, not merely as this human being elevated to some kind of divine-like status. So in other words, it's not the slam dunk argument that some people might think it is, and you need to do a little bit more work to show the divinity of Jesus, that he's not divine by grace, but rather that he is divine by nature, and then provide some arguments for that. Because I could see a skeptic who would deny the divinity of Jesus just pushing back on this. In fact, I have seen some before. In fact, we saw Dr. Stephen Nemesh in another video do this very thing. So what he'll offer in response, he's a Unitarian. He'll deny that Jesus is divine by nature, and he'll just say that he's divine by grace. And if you appeal to things like him being worshipped, he'll appeal to this issue with First Enoch. So kind of be aware that there's arguments like that going on in apologetics, and you'll want to shore up your arguments for Jesus's divinity as divine by nature rather than by grace. And offer a little bit more than, well, he's worshipped in the New Testament kind of an argument in light of what we're seeing here. So that's another reason why you need to be aware of what's going on here with First Enoch. Well, I hope this was helpful. If it was, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Let me know your thoughts. Put them in the comment section. And don't forget, check me out at patreon.com/Reason to Theology. God bless. Are you ready to deepen your faith and sharpen your understanding of theology? Welcome to the Center for Theological Research, your gateway to transformative learning. At CTR, you will find in-depth courses designed to equip you with the tools to grow in your understanding of the faith. Explore courses like the 7 Ecumenical Councils and uncover the foundational truths that shape Christianity. Master the ability to determine the level of a doctrine in the Theological Notes course. And in the Logical Fallacies and Apologetics course, you'll learn to spot the logical errors often encountered in non-Catholic apologetics content. Also, check out the ebooks that are available to you for free. Start your journey today. Visit ctresearch.org and take the next step in your faith formation. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com